The Montana winter came early that year, settling over the Bitterroot Valley like a heavy wool blanket. Marcus Webb stood in the skeleton of what would become the Henderson family's dream cabin, his calloused hands running along the angled support beam he'd just installed. The beam cut diagonally across the frame at what looked like an awkward 45-degree angle, meeting the vertical post in an unconventional joint. "Hey Marcus, what in God's name is that supposed to be?" Trevor Magnuson, the project supervisor, had appeared in the doorway, his expensive boots crunching through sawdust. Behind him stood 3 other contractors, their expressions ranging from confused to openly mocking. Marcus straightened up, wiping wood shavings from his worn Carhartt jacket. "It's a diagonal compression beam. Distributes the load across multiple points instead of concentrating it on a single vertical line." Trevor laughed, a sharp bark that echoed through the unfinished space. "Son, I've been building cabins in these mountains for 23 years. That looks like something a first-year architecture student would dream up after too many beers." The other men chuckled. Marcus felt heat rising up his neck, but he kept his voice steady. "With all due respect, Mr. Magnuson, the math supports this design. These mountains get heavy snow loads, sometimes 3 feet or more. Traditional straight beams handle vertical pressure fine, but when you add lateral wind forces, save the engineering lecture, Webb." Trevor cut him off, pulling out his phone to take a picture of the angled beam. "This is going in my collection of construction mistakes. You know what the Hendersons are paying for this cabin? $470,000. They want something that looks right, not some experimental nonsense. It will look right when it's finished." Marcus held his ground. "And more importantly, it'll stand strong." Marcus had grown up in Missoula, the son of a single mother who cleaned houses for the wealthy families in the Rattlesnake Valley. He'd put himself through Montana State University working 3 jobs, graduating with a degree in structural engineering and a mountain of debt. But the corporate firms in Seattle and Denver wanted young hotshots with no family ties, not a quiet guy from Montana who still said yes ma'am and no sir. So he'd come home and started working construction, applying his engineering knowledge to every project while saving money to start his own firm someday. He was 32 now, and that dream felt further away than ever. Trevor walked around the beam, shaking his head. "The Hendersons get here next week to check progress. This comes out before then, understood? We do things the right way here, the traditional way. The traditional way isn't always the strongest way." Marcus regretted the words the moment they left his mouth. Trevor's face hardened. "You questioning my experience, kid? I'm questioning whether we're building for beauty or for survival." Marcus met his eyes. "These mountains don't care about tradition." The silence stretched out, broken only by the wind howling through the gaps in the walls. Finally, Trevor pointed at the beam. "You've got until Friday. That comes down or you do. Your choice." He walked out, the other contractors following. One of them, a guy named Dale who Marcus sometimes had lunch with, paused at the door. "Man, why do you always have to make things difficult? Just build it like everyone else does." When they were gone, Marcus sat on a stack of plywood, looking up at his angled beam. He'd spent hours on the calculations, checking and rechecking the load distributions, the stress points, the way forces would travel through the structure. He knew he was right, but knowing and proving were 2 different things. His phone buzzed. A text from his mother. "How's the job going, honey? Remember, keep your head down and do good work. That's all that matters." Marcus typed back a thumbs-up emoji, though his stomach twisted with doubt. That evening, he stayed late at the site, measuring and documenting everything about his angled beam design. He took photographs from every angle, noted the dimensions, the type of wood, the joining technique. If he was going to lose this job, at least he'd have a record of what he'd tried to do. The cabin sat on a ridge overlooking the valley, and from where Marcus stood, he could see the lights of other mountain homes dotting the landscape. How many of them had been built the traditional way? How many had already developed stress cracks in their beams, hidden behind drywall and pine paneling? He thought about his mother, working herself to exhaustion so he could get an education. He thought about every professor who'd told him his ideas had merit, every textbook that confirmed what he believed about load distribution and structural integrity. But he also thought about his empty bank account, the rent due in 2 weeks, and the fact that jobs in this valley were hard to come by, especially for someone with a reputation as a troublemaker. Marcus locked up the site and drove home through the darkness, the angled beam haunting his thoughts like an unanswered question. Friday morning arrived with fresh snow and a decision Marcus hadn't been able to make. He pulled into the construction site at 6 a.m., 2 hours before the crew was scheduled to arrive, hoping the silence would bring clarity. Instead, he found Trevor's truck already there. The supervisor stood inside the cabin frame, a reciprocating saw in his hands, its cord snaking back to a generator rumbling outside. He was positioning the blade against Marcus's angled beam. "Stop." Marcus's voice came out harder than he'd intended. Trevor turned, his expression cold and matter-of-fact. "You had your chance, Webb. Time's up. That beam is load-bearing. You cut it now, the whole frame could shift. It's my site, my call." Trevor squeezed the trigger, and the saw screamed to life. Marcus moved without thinking, stepping between the beam and the blade. Trevor released the trigger, the sudden silence almost deafening. "Get out of the way. Let me remove it properly. At least let me do that." Marcus's voice was steady, but inside, his heart hammered against his ribs. If you cut it wrong, you could compromise the entire structure. Trevor studied him for a long moment, then lowered the saw. "You've got 1 hour. Install a proper vertical support, remove this thing, and then clear out your tools. You're done here." The words landed like a physical blow. Marcus had known this was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. "Mr. Magnuson, 1 hour, Webb. And consider yourself lucky I don't bill you for wasted materials." Trevor walked out, leaving Marcus alone with the beam he'd fought so hard to defend. He sat down on the cold concrete foundation, his breath visible in the morning air. Around him, the skeleton of the cabin seemed to mock his failure. His phone buzzed. A message from Dale. "Sorry, man. Trevor's telling everyone you're fired. Says you couldn't follow simple instructions." Marcus closed his eyes. In a small community like this, word traveled fast. By noon, every contractor in the valley would know that Marcus Webb was difficult, insubordinate, someone who thought he was smarter than everyone else. He stood up slowly, running his hand along the angled beam one last time. He'd done everything right. The calculations were perfect. The execution was flawless. But none of that mattered when tradition held more weight than innovation. As he began gathering his tools, Marcus heard vehicles pulling up outside. Multiple trucks, voices, the rest of the crew arriving early, probably eager to witness his humiliation. But then he heard something else. A woman's voice, unfamiliar and authoritative, cutting through the morning air. "Someone want to tell me why there's a saw set up next to my cabin's support structure?" Marcus walked to the entrance and froze. Standing in the snow was Catherine Henderson herself, the client, with her husband Robert beside her. And she was staring directly at Trevor, her expression demanding an answer. Trevor recovered quickly, switching on his professional smile. "Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Henderson, we weren't expecting you until next week." Catherine Henderson stepped into the cabin frame, her sharp eyes sweeping across the structure. She was in her mid-50s, wearing a North Face jacket and boots that had actually seen mountain trails, not just showroom floors. Robert followed quietly behind her, a tablet tucked under his arm. "We decided to come early." Catherine walked directly to the angled beam, running her fingers along the joint where it met the vertical post. "And it's a good thing we did." "What's going on here?" "Just correcting a structural error, ma'am." Trevor gestured dismissively toward Marcus. "One of our workers installed a non-standard beam. We're replacing it with proper vertical support." "Non-standard?" Catherine turned to Marcus. "You installed this?" "Yes, ma'am." Marcus stepped forward, his throat dry. "It's a diagonal compression beam designed to distribute snow loads and lateral wind pressure more effectively than traditional vertical supports. He's been let go from the project." Trevor's voice had an edge now. "We'll have this corrected by... I'm a civil engineer." Catherine cut him off, her attention still fixed on the beam. She pulled out her phone, turning on the flashlight to examine the joint more closely. "Robert, get me the structural plans." Her husband opened his tablet, fingers swiping quickly. Catherine studied the screen, then looked back at the beam, then at the screen again. The plans show vertical beams only. She looked at Marcus. Why did you deviate? Marcus felt every eye on him. This was it. His last chance to explain or his last moment of humiliation. The original plans don't account for the ridge location and exposure level. This site gets cross-valley winds that create lateral pressure traditional frames aren't designed to handle. The angled beam transfers those forces through multiple load paths instead of concentrating stress on single points. Show me your calculations. Marcus pulled out his phone with shaking hands, opening the photos he'd taken of his notebook pages. Catherine took the phone, scrolling through images of equations, force diagrams, and load distribution models. The silence stretched out for what felt like hours. Trevor shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Henderson, with respect, we've built 17 cabins in this valley using traditional methods. Every single one is still standing. Catherine didn't look up from the phone. Robert, pull up the inspection report from the Morrison cabin. Robert tapped his tablet. The one we looked at last year? The one we almost bought. Catherine handed Marcus his phone back. The one with stress cracks in every major support beam after just 5 years. She turned to Trevor, her expression unreadable. How many of your 17 cabins have you inspected recently? Actually opened up the walls and checked the beams? Trevor's confident demeanor cracked slightly. That's not standard practice unless there's visible damage. Maybe it should be. Catherine looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and for the first time that morning, he felt something other than defeat. If you're watching this and rooting for Marcus, take a moment and subscribe to the channel. This story is just getting started, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Robert cleared his throat. Catherine, the structural engineer we hired to review the plans, is calling in 10 minutes. Perfect timing. Catherine pulled out her business card, handing it to Marcus. Send me everything. All your calculations, material specs, load analysis. Everything. Marcus took the card with trembling fingers. Yes, ma'am. She turned back to Trevor. That beam stays exactly where it is until I say otherwise. Understood? The video call happened right there in the unfinished cabin, with Catherine's structural engineer patched in from Seattle. Marcus stood off to the side, watching as the engineer reviewed his calculations on screen, asking technical questions that Marcus answered with growing confidence. The math is sound. The engineer's voice crackled through the tablet speaker. Actually, it's more than sound. This is sophisticated work. Where did you study? Montana State. Marcus kept his voice level, but inside, something was rebuilding itself. Structural engineering, class of 2015. The engineer was quiet for a moment. And you're working as a general contractor? Trying to pay off student loans. The words came out before Marcus could stop them. Honest and unfiltered. Catherine ended the call and turned to face the small crowd that had gathered. Trevor stood with his arms crossed, his face carefully neutral. The other contractors watched in silence. Mr. Magnuson, I'm going to be direct. Catherine's voice carried authority earned through years of making difficult decisions. We're making a change to the project scope. I want Marcus to review every structural element of this cabin and recommend modifications where appropriate. Trevor's jaw tightened. Mrs. Henderson, I've been the supervisor on this project from the beginning, and you'll continue to be the supervisor for the general construction. But structural decisions will go through Marcus first. She looked at Marcus. If you're willing to take on that responsibility. Marcus felt the weight of every gaze in the room. This was more than a job offer. It was a fork in the road, a choice between staying invisible and stepping into the light. I'm willing. His voice was steady now. But I need full authority on structural matters. No compromises on safety, regardless of aesthetics or tradition. Agreed. Catherine extended her hand. Marcus shook it, feeling calluses that matched his own. She'd built things too, he realized. She understood. The next 3 weeks transformed the project. Marcus identified 6 additional points where angled supports would strengthen the structure. He redesigned the roof truss system to better handle snow accumulation. He caught a foundation issue that would have caused settling problems within 2 years. Trevor maintained a cold professionalism, but the other contractors slowly warmed to Marcus. Dale started asking questions about load calculations during lunch. Even the older framers began consulting him before making cuts. Then March arrived with a late-season storm that weather forecasters called historic. 40-mile-per-hour winds howled through the valley, carrying wet, heavy snow that accumulated at rates of 3 inches per hour. All construction stopped. The crew gathered at Murphy's Bar in town, watching news reports of roof collapses across western Montana. Marcus's phone rang at 8 p.m. It was Catherine. "Get to the cabin now." His stomach dropped. He drove through the blizzard, his truck sliding on icy roads, convinced he'd find his work destroyed. When he arrived, Catherine and Robert stood in the snow with flashlights, illuminating the cabin frame. But the structure stood perfect and true, the angled beams flexing slightly under the massive load, doing exactly what Marcus had designed them to do. Around the valley, he could see other construction sites with tarps torn loose, frames sagging, some completely collapsed. Catherine turned to him, snow gathering in her hair. "Tomorrow morning, I want you to call every contractor in this valley. Tell them you're opening an engineering consultation firm, and I'm your first investor." The Henderson cabin was completed in May, standing as a testament to innovation over tradition. Marcus walked through the finished space with Catherine and Robert, noting how the angled beams had been incorporated into the design aesthetic, stained dark and exposed against white pine walls. "This is beautiful." Robert ran his hand along one of the diagonal supports. "You can actually see the engineering. That was the idea." Marcus smiled. "Structure doesn't have to hide." Catherine handed him an envelope. Inside was a check and a business card with fresh ink. Webb Structural Engineering, with his name and a phone number he'd activated that morning. "The investment we discussed. $50,000 to get you started. Office space, software, insurance, marketing." She paused. "And my condition is that you hire at least 2 people within the first year. Your knowledge shouldn't stay locked in one person's head." Marcus stared at the check, thinking of every night his mother had come home exhausted, every year he'd spent swallowing his ideas to keep a paycheck. "Thank you doesn't feel like enough. Then prove it was worth it. Build things that last." Word spread fast in the valley. The cabin that survived the March storm became legendary. Contractors started calling, some sheepish, some genuinely curious. Marcus consulted on projects throughout Montana, then Wyoming, then Colorado. Each job built his reputation. Each success brought more work. Trevor Magnuson called 6 months later. His voice was stiff, formal. "I've got a client building on Snowball Ridge. Exposed site. They're asking for someone who understands mountain engineering." Marcus met him at the site, where Trevor stood beside a young contractor who looked nervous and overwhelmed. "This is Danny, my nephew. Fresh out of school with a structural engineering degree and nowhere that'll hire him." The parallel wasn't lost on Marcus. He spent the afternoon teaching Danny the same principles he'd fought to implement, watching the young man's eyes light up with understanding. That evening, Trevor lingered as Danny packed up. "I was wrong about you, Webb. Took me a while to admit it, but there it is. You weren't being difficult. You were being right. We were both right about different things." Marcus surprised himself with the generosity. "You know how to build. I know how to engineer. Together, we make something stronger." They shook hands, a genuine reconciliation built on mutual respect. Marcus hired Danny the following week, then brought on Sarah Chun, a brilliant engineer from Seattle who was tired of corporate life. By winter, Webb Structural Engineering occupied a small office in Missoula with 3 employees and a waiting list of clients. His mother visited on a Saturday, bringing homemade sandwiches and looking around the office with tears in her eyes. "Your father would have been so proud. He always said you had something special." Marcus hugged her tight, thinking about the angled beam that had almost cost him everything. "Sometimes the strongest path isn't the straight one, Mom. Sometimes you have to trust the angle you can't see yet." 3 years later, Marcus stood in front of 200 people at the Montana Engineering Conference in Billings. The projection screen behind him showed before and after images of structures throughout the Rocky Mountain region, each one incorporating his diagonal load distribution principles. What started as one controversial beam in a single cabin has now been implemented in over 60 structures across 5 states. Marcus advanced the slide, showing a graph of structural failures. In comparable buildings using traditional methods, we've seen a 12% failure rate during extreme weather events. In structures using angled compression systems, that rate drops to 0.3%. The audience, filled with engineers, contractors, and architects, leaned forward. These weren't just numbers. These were homes that stayed standing, families that stayed safe, investments that held their value. After the presentation, a line formed. Contractors wanting consultations. Students asking about internships. One older engineer pumped his hand with genuine enthusiasm. I've been building in these mountains for 40 years, and I've never seen someone challenge the fundamentals like this. It's about damn time. Catherine Henderson waited until the crowd thinned. She wore a name tag identifying her as a conference sponsor. I brought someone who wanted to see you. Trevor Magnuson stepped forward, looking uncomfortable but determined. He held out a blueprint. I'm building my retirement home on the ridge above the Henderson place. I want you to design the whole structure. No arguments, no traditional methods. Just whatever you think will stand strongest. Marcus took the blueprint, genuinely moved. I'd be honored. That evening, Marcus drove out to the Henderson cabin. He'd made a habit of visiting every few months, checking on his first major project. The structure stood perfect against the sunset, the angled beams visible through the large windows, creating geometric shadows across the interior. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Office is swamped. We need to hire 2 more engineers. Also, University of Montana wants you to teach a course next semester. Marcus sat on the cabin's porch, looking out over the valley where lights were beginning to flicker on in homes he'd helped design. His mother had retired last year, finally able to rest after decades of hard work. Danny was leading his own projects now. The firm was profitable, sustainable, growing. But more than any of that, the work mattered. Every structure he touched became safer, stronger, more resilient against the forces that mountain living demanded. His mind drifted back to that morning when Trevor had stood with a saw, ready to cut down everything Marcus believed in. If Catherine Henderson hadn't arrived at that exact moment, none of this would exist. His career would have ended before it truly began. But she had arrived, and Marcus had stood his ground. And sometimes that's all it takes, the courage to trust your knowledge when everyone else trusts tradition. Marcus pulled out his phone and opened his notes app, sketching a new beam configuration he'd been considering. The mountains had taught him well. Strength doesn't always follow a straight line. Sometimes it angles, flexes, and distributes pressure in ways that seem wrong until the storm comes and proves them right.